All right, for anyone who pops in, tonight's discussion is going to be: did the U.S. and or Donald Trump violate any laws in the capture of Maduro, the president of Venezuela? So feel free to drop your comments in there. I'll get into my thoughts a little bit later, but let's have a good discussion and see what we all think. Of course, Maduro was serving a third term as the president of Venezuela, although very likely the U.S. has not recognized him since 2020 because of the shady circumstances around that election. More than likely, he kind of stole it, and Biden had issued a reward for an arrest that he had up to $25 million right before he left office in January of last year. For me, with one law that says the president can do this, and it's the same law that presidents like Clinton and Obama have used controversially. I believe what you're mentioning is the military use or the military use of force authorization, and I believe that's the same one that um, was passed in 2001. Excuse me, and that Obama used to get Bin Laden. And yeah, that law is pretty controversial because I mean, and that's the thing getting into it's breaking U.S. laws is one thing, but breaking international laws is another. But then also, really, the only thing mostly that I could find that was violated in this instance was the UN Charter from 1945, which UN enforcement of anything, particularly in one of the big nations, is pretty toothless because the U.S. is one of the five big countries, including I think the U.K. and France and China, that can just veto punishment. So something could be levied, some kind of sanction, some kind of fine, some kind of trade embargo, an arms deal embargo, but the U.S. has the power to just block it. So effectively, there's not any punishment really that could be levied from an international standpoint. I know the UK has come out and said they weren't involved at all, and I don't believe any other nations really were involved other than the US. Curiously, what does everyone think the motivations were for this? Because obviously, some people were saying it's, well, on the right, they're saying, well, Maduro was a criminal, and he was. I don't think anyone's arguing in the favor of Maduro here. In that Venezuela is bringing drug or sending drugs to the U.S. On the left, they're saying, well, it's a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, and it only will encourage, nation states like Russia and China to act more aggressively, like the way they do now with Ukraine and Taiwan. So, it's a real double-edged sword here. Yeah, I'd say you're right there, Heinz. My issue is the first the first thing Trump did before all this was start seizing oil tankers, and also, and I've been reading a little bit into this. Apparently, some U.S. companies were authorized to be drilling for oil in Venezuela, and he kind of screwed them over, from what I understand. My best friend was telling me, and he's far wiser than I am. Um, that in some sense this will be beneficial to the international oil market because Venezuela is the world's largest in terms of oil on the land. Venezuela's got more than we do, more than Saudi Arabia, and if the U.S. does take it over and sell it, it would probably be pretty cheap compared to other nations' prices because really the only thing they have to do is just sell it at a higher price than they would sell it for on the black market. Which could be, good. It's going to be bad for other oil exporting nations, which are probably not very happy with this. So that's probably what's going to happen. I don't necessarily think Trump broke any rules with capturing Maduro. I mean, he violated the UN Charter. Depends on what you call that a rule. Um, and that's the thing. I didn't. I haven't seen him say this. Say it's a declaration of war. I heard him say that he does not want regime change, and that's another thing. Regime change in South America by the U.S. is not a new concept. Eisenhower in the 50s did that all the time. It probably will be good for the Venezuelans, but from my perspective, I think it would be best to leave it up to the Venezuelan people. Historically, when the people get fed up with your crap, we've seen this with the U.S. Revolution, the French Revolution. They'll take you down if they have to. Yeah, I think that's true. He's built a criminal, and this will ultimately be good for Venezuelans. And yeah, I want to know what Venezuelans have to say about it. Because I saw a news piece today where they were like, "Well, we're going to go talk to some Venezuelans," but they were in America. I'd like to see what the people on the ground are really saying about this. I can't imagine they're that upset about it. The real question to me, what's the follow up from this going to be? What is the Venezuelan military going to do, if anything? What are because what are the other government officials doing? I don't really know how their government system's set up, even theoretically. Um, Many of them supposedly are happy, and we're terrified. I would imagine they're happy because, again, I don't think Maduro is popular in Venezuela. The whole thing about the drug trafficking is just nonsense. I mean, Venezuela, if you were going to go toppling regimes and capturing or exporting serious amounts of illegal drugs to the U.S., Venezuela, I don't even think they're in the top 10. Colombia, Nicaragua, I think Honduras, they're far higher on the list, but they don't have anything to offer in the form of oil. And and I don't think it's out of place to draw comparisons to the Iraq War. Yeah, that's true, Jackman. Stalin and Mao did die in power. I guess it just depends. The people just have to get hungry enough, you know. And I guess the Venezuelans weren't quite hungry enough. But also, you have to realize, I'm pretty sure that he had like the military in his pocket, because ultimately, the military in a country like Venezuela is really just kind of a roving series of different gangs that are just being paid for loyalty to whatever regime is giving the highest dollar. And we got 11 people in here. That's a new record. But obviously, there will be no domestic consequences, I don't think, for Trump for this. I think worst case scenario is you see an impeachment when after the midterms, when the Dems more than likely take control of the House, which would be bad for them as a party more than obviously. I don't see any scenario where any impeachment inquiries into Trump lead to a removal. If it was going to happen, it would have happened already after J6. But I think this is another one Trump's just going to get away with. But obviously, we can't run Venezuela forever, and that's what Trump says we're doing. So what's the next step from here? Do the Venezuelans have an actual election? What do we do? Because obviously, it's going to be someone that the U.S. wants it to be. Even if there are candidates, quote unquote. The reason we're going to Venezuela so Trump will hopefully get people's minds off the Epstein files and that whole crazy saga. I think it would it's not crazy to think that. Steve Bannon talks all the time that flooding the zone. You're constantly throwing things. Now, I would say for most people, at least what I've seen online, it's not working necessarily. Like a lot of things Trump does, it'll be a short-term distraction, but it's going to keep coming back because the Epstein file thing, it's so in depth. I mean, just from a document standpoint, just tens upon hundreds of thousands of them that are constantly being gone through. I was really surprised Trump didn't have a successor in mind. Trump doesn't have a successor in mind for himself. It's presumably going to be Vance, but I don't think Trump is really invested. Trump is a lot like that quote from The Dark Knight. He's like a dog chasing cars. He doesn't know what to do with it when he actually catches one, because I don't think he ever expects to actually catch it. So it's kind of similar to the event of what George H.W. Bush did in Panama. Yeah, kind of. I would say, though, just from comparing those two human beings, I would be slightly more trusting of something H.W. Bush did. Because again, I think he's in that class of presidents that might have done something dumb, but did it with the best intentions. And for me, and I've made no bones about hiding this, I am not a fan of Donald Trump, and I'm generally distrustful of anything he does, particularly in something like this, when he was already blowing up all those small fishing boats, which clearly did not have the fuel capacity to go from Venezuela to the American mainland. I wonder who the person, I'd have to look this up, the candidate that lost to Maduro, or quote unquote lost. Wonder what he's thinking about this whole situation, or if he's going to try to make a comeback. Because yeah, Trump obviously doesn't have a successor, and I think anyone that he publicly backs is just going to be what someone tells him to back. But if this results in cheaper gas, then I mean, really, that's going to be a W for him, really, because his bases they don't care if he says he's the peace president; they find a way to justify his actions. Maria Machado is the lady, and I bet she'll try to get it, especially having won the Nobel Prize. Yeah, probably. Um, it again all just depends on how in depth we are going to be in the Venezuelan government. Like, what are we really running other than their oil business? Are we even really invested? Because I mean, regime change is one thing, but restructuring the government's another. So is the plan just to leave their system intact with a different person, or just to completely change the whole thing? I will be curious to see if this affects Trump's polling numbers at all in terms of his approval rating, because it's already historically low. I think it's the lowest it's ever been for him, other than maybe during COVID. My prediction is probably not much. I mean, you see a couple people like Marjorie Taylor Greene that are calling this out, but they're really true isolationists, and also recently spurned by Trump, obviously. So, I mean, you probably see people like Rand Paul or maybe Mitch McConnell not being in favor of this, but I don't see a lot of the MAGA base being turned off by this behavior. I did find it interesting they took his wife too. If he's going to stand trial, what would what is holding her supposed to do, or was she involved in any of his illicit activities? I think a lot of his fans will applaud a show of strength. Yeah, probably. And one thing people have been saying that I've seen is when challenged with, well, Trump says he's the peace president. Um, how do you justify this? And they say, well, it's peace through strength, which which you can see that sometimes peace means having a bigger stick than the other guy. Yeah, Hines, I really don't know what the wife did, or they just kind of took him as a package deal, maybe to get leverage on him. Trump admin is the law. Well, that's not how the law works. The law is what the law is. A current administration, just because they're elected, doesn't mean they just get to do whatever they want. Now, the problem is the people who were supposed to check abuses of power also happen to be on their team. And one of the short sides of the founders is they did not anticipate political parties, or even if they did, they anticipated people would kind of rise above them to do that. And we've seen very few checks on Trump really basically none by the legislature. There was one Senate vote to block his use of tariffs, but I don't think it even made it to a vote in the House. Other than that, you've seen one, two, maybe three Supreme Court things that actually kind of stop him from doing something, like the troop deployments most recently. But most of the time, if he's blocked by a federal judge, 90 some odd percent of the time, if it makes it to the Supreme Court, they're just going to overrule it in his favor or do the shadow docket thing where they just say, well, we're going to let it continue until we work it out. It's a highly educated feminist and deeply involved in his administration's decision making. Okay. Maybe she's the Nancy Reagan to his Ronnie. Not that Nancy Reagan was a feminist, but obviously involved in his decision making. Probably less psychic mediums involved. I have to look into the Venezuelans' terms of office. I think they're 4 years like ours. Actually, no. I actually don't know how long they are. Because if he's in his theoretical third term, then when would it have been up? Or did he just kind of rip up the Constitution? Can you explain to me how actively the president can do military actions without Congress? What is their extended limits beyond just asking Congress to do so because their laws or actions? So the Constitution gives the president the authority to be the commander in chief of the military. He doesn't have the ability to declare war. But one thing you have to keep in mind, we haven't actually declared war since like World War II. Most of the time, like with things in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, what it is, the president has the authority to issue 90-day deployments, and they basically just keep renewing them. The president doesn't necessarily have to get congressional approval to execute a military action. The issue you have here, it's not only a sovereign nation, it's the leader of that sovereign nation, whether unjustly elected or not, is, even if it's not recognized by the U.S. And then sometimes when it's a covert operation, like getting Osama, for example, if you go asking permission in public, then the person you're trying to get knows that it's coming, and that's one thing Obama and the SEAL team had talked about at the time was the incredible risk here, because if U.S. personnel go down, it might be hard to retrieve them. And from what I understand, CIA have been in Venezuela for months, kind of gathering information, being close to the people around Maduro to kind of make this possible. And that in and of itself is probably already a violation of international law, at least the UN Charter, which again, that the UN has never really been good at enforcing anything, at least on any big powers, because again, the US has a veto, you know, of punitive actions taken by the UN, and I guess that would include themselves. And I honestly, China and or Russia might also veto it just on the grounds that they're kind of doing the same stuff. They admitted to not telling Congress even when directly asked. I mean, you got to give Trump this. The guy's got balls. I mean, he'll do whatever, in public, and then either pretend he didn't do it, lie about it, or just say, "Nah, I'm the president." And that's another thing that really makes me mad. I think this is more than likely, if not anything else he's done, going to lead to another damn impeachment, which is not going to be good for anybody. If people want to move past Trump, then they just need to vote for someone else. We already tried. We got someone else in. They took forever trying to do anything about it. And now you've got Jack Smith running around talking about, well, here are the 5 things that Trump really did wrong. Well, too little, too late. So just vote them out and just move on. He won. We have to accept it. It sucks, but he's just kind of getting away with stuff. Vote in the midterms. Democrats would be very stupid to impeach over this. Yeah, they would. But, and I say this as someone who generally votes Democrat, I would not put it past them. I guarantee, I would bet a kidney that in the next 2 years after the midterms, Trump will be impeached. Do I honestly think Trump would get impeaching? I do. I think he will. He was almost immediately impeached, in the first half of his first term, and then again right before he. And that was another stupid thing. Like, I get the symbolic nature of impeaching him, but why are you doing it 2 weeks before he's leaving office? That is just it leaves a bad taste in the American people's mouths because the people that want him gone, well, he's already been voted out, so you're just wasting taxpayer dollars, especially if you know it's not going to happen. And even if they were to do it now, you wouldn't even get, I think with one impeachment, we got 57 votes. People like Romney, and there were like six or half a dozen, like the Susan Collins of the world that would vote against it. They're just not there anymore. They've retired. They're gone. With all of this pressure and stress that is weighing heavily, and also his bad medical issues, including his dementia, besides, what do you think Trump will survive his term if he doesn't die of a stroke? Um, I don't think Donald Trump is in great physical condition. I think he's very clearly in a deteriorating mental condition. Like 2016 Trump would wipe the floor with this guy. That guy was vibrant. That guy was energetic. And that's one reason people didn't notice the fact that he was the oldest president ever, because he didn't act like it. This Trump is old man Trump. I don't think he's going to die this term. And frankly, I don't want him to, because then we'll be stuck with a 44-year-old President Vance, who is genuinely kind of evil and not someone you want to be the president, because he is a very evil kind of guy. The thing about stress of being the president is you have to take the job seriously and actually be concerned about things. And I don't think Trump is. No one who spends, a tenth of the time as any other president in briefings, or who spends his entire day watching Fox News and eating fast food. He's just not concerned about it. He likes the trappings of being president, which is one thing I don't understand about really doing it, is because as a billionaire, you kind of have all those trappings anyway. Give us a number. How many years does he live past 2028? I don't know. Evil people with terrible diets can live well into their 90s. I mean, Reagan was well into his 90s with it, and in the last 10 to 15 years, his brain was just completely gone. So, I mean, see, how old is Trump now? He'll be 82 this year. He'll be 84 when he leaves. So, I don't see him making it to 90 based on the things I've seen about him physically, but stranger things have happened. Let's just say theoretically we get whatever next president. I don't know that he lives to the end of that term. I don't know that he'll live long enough, for example, to see his oh, that's right, he was born in 46. I was thinking 44. So yeah, he'll be 80 this year. I don't see him living, for example, to see his own presidential library open, which may or may not be the worst thing ever, because it's just going to be a MAGA shrine for them to circle around like Mussolini's grave for the end of time, which is not really good. But presidential libraries are historically biased towards whatever the president is, no matter who it is. So I'll say 10 years tops after leaving office, but probably less than 6. LBJ lived 5 after leaving office, and that was, he probably would have had a stroke if he had gotten that second full term. Well, they built it in New York, probably. New York or Florida. If he puts it in New York, he'd probably want it somewhere around his tower. But I think he would have a much easier time building it in Florida. And actually, no, I think he already has a dedicated spot in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. How many years will it take to completely undo most of the things of the Trump era? I mean, that depends on what you mean. Most of what Trump has done has been executive orders. The only really bill he's gotten through was the big, beautiful bill, and that was a reconciliation bill. So the Democrats will easily undo that as soon as they've got majority back. They're going to win the House back in 26, and they'll get pretty close to the Senate. They'll probably get the Senate back in 28. So that kind of stuff can be undone. The problem is it's the reciprocal damage of these actions that you can't fix, like USAID got put back into place, but for that 3 to 6 months that it was screwed up, there are hundreds upon thousands of children that will be born with AIDS and die, and you can't undo that kind of thing. Trump obviously has selected a third of the judiciary in his first term alone, and that includes a third of the Supreme Court. He's more than likely going to get one or two more picks this term, depending on if Thomas and Alito are willing to leave. So, in terms of laws to repeal, there's not a lot. The problem is a lot of his financial things, like the tax cuts, are at least on paper popular, even if they shouldn't be. But it won't really take that long. Newsom or whatever, and he'll probably be the nominee. Whatever Democrat comes in, he'll undo all the executive orders day one. That's the new thing these days. Here's a stack of executive orders to sign. The laws from decency will never go back. I wouldn't say never. It'll be a while though. I mean, we came back from the Civil War. We came back from Thomas and Jefferson going at each other. It'll probably be 10, 20, 30 years. It's going to take, it depends really. If we elect more Republicans, will they be more civil and less crass? And I think that'll be the case because generally speaking, Trump is not good for elections. When it's not a presidential election, and even still, he generally will outperform. But like in midterms, like in 2018 was a nightmare. 2020 was not good. 2022 was a surprisingly good performance for Democrats. And even in 2024, Trump couldn't get a lot of Republicans elected in other places like North Carolina. Most likely Democratic candidate in 2026. I disagree. And he's my senator. Him and also I'm from Georgia. Now, I like Warnock, but I do think well, he'd have to be candidate in 28, but I think he could be a good vice presidential pick. The problem is he doesn't have a lot of national attention, you know. Newsom, at least he's kind of slowed down a little bit lately, but he's been kind of all over the place, you know, getting his face out there, getting to the idea of people seeing him. And of course, he's from a bigger state. But Warnock could be a good vice presidential candidate. But right now, my call for who the Democratic ticket's going to be is it's going to be Newsom and Governor Moore from Maryland as the VP. And on the Republican side, it's going to be Vance, and his VP will probably be like Nancy Mace or maybe Marco Rubio. This all depends on how the primary goes. But we'll see. Now, I like Warnock, but I do think I hope y'all heard all that. It told me my connection was unstable. I think those 2028 picks are perfect. I appreciate that. Now, what I would say is I'm not going to vote for Newsom in the primary. He's not who I want it to be. He's just who I'm fairly certain it is going to be. Okay, good. I try not to use streaming software outside of YouTube too much just because my internet down here is not the greatest and I don't want to put any extra pressure on my system and whatnot. But on the Democratic side, really, if you can win black turnout, you'll get the nomination. And that's just a fact. That's what helped Biden win, despite the fact that Sanders came out of the gate in 2020. I mean, just sweeping primaries left and right. Honestly, if I were to pick a candidate, I would go with someone like Pete Buttigieg, maybe Shapiro from Pennsylvania. They just they're just not going to get it. None of them poll very well with African American voters, and you just can't win a Democratic primary if you can't get black turnout. You just can't. Could I see Warnock being the candidate in 2032? No, because whoever the candidate in 28 is going to be is going to theoretically run for re-election. Now, could he be in 36? Sure. It all depends. I like Warnock. I wouldn't be opposed to him being the candidate in 28. I just don't think he's going to. I don't think, one, that he wants to run, and two, you also have to keep in mind he's a party guy. So in Georgia, the governor would fill the vacancy. So if we don't have a Democratic governor, he's not going to step aside because then that Senate seat would automatically get filled by a Republican, even if in a special election it would flip back to a Democrat. So now, if we elect a Democratic governor this year, because we're going to have an election for governor here this year in Georgia, if we elect a Democrat, then maybe he'd be more likely to do it. But I'm not opposed to him being a candidate. I like him. I've told people before, and they think I'm crazy, that he'd be a good candidate. But you got to do something to get national attention. We're way past the point in time of like a Jimmy Carter getting the presidential nomination by just canvassing the streets and shaking hands. You've got to do something big and dramatic. But Warnock also, he's got the juice to obviously, being the successor at an MLK's church, could obviously get great black turnout. So he could potentially be a sleeper candidate that he could run and just sweep the primary. But then the question becomes, can he win the general? And I've watched his senatorial debates. He's a good speaker. He's a charismatic speaker, and you obviously have to be a preacher. And that's certainly something that centrists on, or independents, especially religious ones, would like, with him being a pastor and all. And he doesn't have a ton of skeletons in his closet that haven't already come out from him running for Senate, and they didn't get in the way of him doing that in what is still effectively a red state. Democrats just need to stop nominating people who are boring as watching paint dry. And I like Governor Walz, but he was a terrible vice presidential pick. When you've got people like Josh Shapiro or Space Cowboy Mark Kelly, there were just better options. We weren't going to lose Minnesota without him on the ticket, but Shapiro being on it could have won us Pennsylvania. The real question is going to be is whoever the GOP candidate going to be in 28, more than likely Vance, but DeSantis and Rubio, you can't count them out yet. Can they get turnout the way Trump can? Because we've seen that when Trump is not on the ticket, turnout is not as good. I mean, we just had statewide elections here in Georgia for our public service commissioners, and the Democrat candidates got 70% of the vote. And now, granted, that was with 65% turnout compared to a presidential year, but that's not a statistic to ignore. Trump gets people to turn out, but will that continue once he's no longer around? I don't think it will. From 92 until 2024, not counting Bush's reelection, because he lost in 2000. Trump was the first one to win the popular vote as a Republican. So that's 32 straight years. I don't see that changing. And Trump's really good at making voters not like him because he's so abrasive. Like, they'll vote for him once, and like the amount of buyer's remorse voters that Trump has is pretty high. But I don't think this Venezuela thing is going to be one of those incidents that makes people not vote for him or whoever he picks as his successor. And interestingly, what Al was saying about Biden and Trump being 4 years apart, Clinton, Bush, and Trump were all born in the same summer in 1946. Do I think Chris Christie could switch parties and be a Democrat and then be a candidate for 2032? Yeah, Vance is defending this thing hard. Will Chris Christie switch parties? I don't. I mean, he could. He won't win though. We have here in Georgia our former lieutenant governor. I forget his name, which is obviously not a good indicator for him. He was the lieutenant governor during the first term of our current governor, Brian Kemp. We have a different lieutenant governor now who is also running for governor. But the first one, he has switched parties and running as a Democrat. Those kind of candidates, like when a Democrat switches Republican or a Republican switches Democrat, those parties like to put those people out, put them at the convention and let them talk. but people are generally distrustful of them, right? Like if like this lieutenant governor here is running as a Democrat because of Trump, that's obviously not going to endear him any GOP voters. And Democrats are going to be like, well, the only reason you swapped is because Trump was so unappealing. There are probably other Democrats we'd rather vote for. So I don't see Chris Christie ever getting a presidential nomination. He's too unpopular with the GOP for going against Trump, and he's too unpopular with Democrats for being a Republican. So would people be happy if he did that? Sure, and maybe he could go back to New Jersey if he's not term limited. But this is slightly off. But if FDR didn't run for more than 2 terms, would there ever be the 2 term limit? Probably not. FDR doing was really the only reason that it happened. The Republicans were like, crap, if if they can do this, then theoretically we may never get elected again, which obviously Truman would not have gotten reelected in 1952. But the Democrats then also thought, well, we wouldn't want this to happen to us in reverse. Just keep in mind, FDR wasn't the first person to do that. Teddy tried to come back for third term in 1912. Grant tried to get the nomination in 1880 and almost got it, but then lost it to Garfield. So it's not unprecedented, but he was the first one to successfully do it. So that would the U.S. is generally not proactive or reactive, so we probably wouldn't have done that had FDR not gone for more than 2 terms. What I'll find curious is if Trump actually does anything to try to get a third term. I don't think he will. At this point, I don't think he will. He's so damn old that I think he's actually going to want to leave in 2028. And Vance has to kind of toe the line because he's actually not that popular with Republicans. Obama would have won 3 terms. Oh, easily. Obama is one of those guys like FDR or like Eisenhower that could have just been president forever. Obama would have beaten Trump in 2016 handily. I really think anyone besides Hillary would have beaten Trump in 2016. Biden in 2016 would have beaten Trump because they would have turned out more voters. I mean, if you look at even Biden in 2020, the amount of actual swing state voters that determine the outcome of the election, it's like 100,000 voters. You know, Obama and Biden could easily have done that. Obama could still be president. Does JD Vance really want to become president? Hell yeah, he does. That dude's a poor ass kid from the Appalachian Mountains that went to Yale, became a Marine, and then got into the Senate. That dude loves him some power. Now, would he be upset if he doesn't win? And I think he's very aware that he probably isn't going to. There's worse things in life than being a former vice president. He could go get any consultant job at any major, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, any funding from or any capital, what's the I don't know the phrase I'm searching for here, but venture capital at any venture capital business, you could get paid tens upon hundreds of thousands of dollars to be to do speaking tours. He's already, I mean, at his age, he's I think the fourth or fifth youngest vice president we've ever had. He does not need to be the president. Does he want to be? I really think he does. I don't think he's gonna be though. But he's so young that even if he loses, he could always come back and try again. A la Nixon. Yeah, he wants it really bad. Because that's the thing. You always hear people talking about like these tech oligarchs and all that stuff. They don't really like Trump. They really like Vance. Like Vance, like that's why I always say people do not want Trump to die in office or for him to resign. You do not want JD Vance to be the president. That dude is evil. Who are your top 5 presidents of all time? Mine are FDR, Lincoln, Washington, Reagan, and Teddy Roosevelt. Well, other than Reagan, that's a good list. Reagan is a abysmal president. My top 5 would be Lincoln, FDR. I've got 8 on the wall here. Let me see if I can pick 5 out. I'd say Lincoln, Washington, although there should be an asterisk next to that says Hamilton, FDR, Eisenhower, and probably Teddy. But on a domestic front, LBJ would be very close. But yeah, that'd probably be. I would probably take your list, swap Reagan for Eisenhower, and that'd be my top five. And we'll do one of these live streams at some point, maybe next week, where I start going through all the rankings. What makes Reagan so bad? So for me, there are kind of like five areas where I judge a president: foreign policy, domestic policy, character, communication, and long-term impact. In terms of communication, Reagan gets all the points. Dude was a television personality, was a movie personality, obviously a stellar politician, so he gets points there. On a foreign policy front, I don't think that he necessarily gets credit for the ending of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. But on a foreign policy front, he also, I think, did quite well. Domestically, did absolutely terrible. He was horrible for the economy. People don't realize they always talk about him cutting taxes. His first and his real only tax cut came in his first year. It was so bad he had to pass 11 subsequent tax increases, which effectively eliminated half of the cuts he initially did because it bankrupted the government. He ignored the AIDS crisis. He took advice from his crazy wife and her psychic medium. He was a horribly racist man. The long-term impacts of Reagan are what we see now. They come in right after Carter, destroying all, breaking the government, really. Reagan is kind of that first Republican that makes the Republican platform basically, let's destroy the government, sell it to the people that it doesn't work, and then privatize it. And that's generally not good. We don't get Donald Trump without Ronald Reagan. Um, People remember Reagan fondly because he was that folksy grandfather, but Iran Contra was blatant treason. He was, for all the people accused like Biden or even Trump of being like a puppet president, Reagan very much likely was. His cabinet was probably doing things behind his back he didn't know about because he was too old and inept to know what to do. And it was a lot like when he was governor. He cut funding for areas that did not need to be cut, just completely ignored the AIDS crisis. And I would say go on HBO. They've got it's a 2 or 3 part thing on Reagan. Take a look at that. Um, At least he liked jelly beans. He did like jelly beans, and his presidential library is one of the cooler ones. He actually there's one of his old Air Force One planes in a hangar in his presidential library, so that's pretty cool. Oh, there goes my chair. But no, Reagan. I don't know that he's in my bottom 10, but he's definitely in my bottom half of presidents. Like I don't hate him, you know. I think a lot of the things he did, he genuinely believed in, so you give him credit for that. But on a long term impact, a domestic policy standpoint, and a character standpoint, he doesn't get a lot of credit for me. But also, he was funny, and people appreciate that. And really, if you are a good communicator in politics, that's all you really need to be popular. Because if you can sell anything to people, then that's all you need. I mean, I'm reading a book right now about how oratory basically spreads myth and ideology. And Reagan was excellent at that. He was great at it in the movies. He was great at it. He made propaganda films in World War II. He was great at it as governor of California. At least Reagan isn't Andrew Johnson, Wilson, or LBJ. I like LBJ. You can see him behind me. He's on the wall. Again, from a foreign policy standpoint, not my favorite. But you cannot look at his domestic agenda and say it's anything but an absolute A plus. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, all these things are just abject winners. Wilson, yes, abysmal. Andrew Johnson, abysmal. Probably the second or worst president of all time. Do you think the Monroe Doctrine is good for America? Mm, Not necessarily. It's one thing to kind of say, "You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone." but we live in too much of a global world now for any sense of isolationism. Um, and we're too deeply involved. We've got our hands in too many pies. We've got a military base in every damn country in the world, which I don't think we need. We're probably a little too involved. We could probably dial it back a little bit, save some taxpayer money. Um, but we can't. We have to find a medium between isolationism and being the world's police. I think the Monroe Doctrine was excellent for the time that it was written, but foreign policy from almost 200 years ago is probably not the best thing to still be using. And actually, that was someone said that to me earlier about how the Monroe Doctrine was the law that Trump was using, and I had to tell them that the Monroe Doctrine, it wasn't a law; it was just a foreign policy, really. And also, we can't tell foreign powers to stay out of our hemisphere if we're not going to stay out of theirs, right? Um, and we do that a lot. We meddle into all kind of things, thinking it's an actual law. Is hilarious. Yeah. And also, Monroe. I don't. He shouldn't even get the credit for it. Quincy Adams wrote the Monroe Doctrine when he was Secretary of State. But Monroe was president when it happened. I disagree, with the idea of the United States saying, "Well, this is our half of the world." There are plenty of other nations in this half of the world that should get a say in what happens over here. But we've got more weapons and more people, so I mean, obviously we get a bigger, you know, if we were a board of directors, we'd have a higher vote share, I suppose. No one's going to step to the United States. And more money. We do have all the dollars. At least for now, anyway. Uh, the value of the dollar is slipping, and the United States credit rating actually fell for like the first time ever this year, which is not a good. I do think we have a recession coming. If not in 26, and before Trump's term is over, we're going to have a pretty solid recession. And you can tell it's not looking good by just the constant hiding of numbers from the Trump administration not being reported. Unemployment going up, inflation going up. These are not good things. If you had to pick a president from the past 50 years or so and place them in the 1900s, 1800s, and 1700s and make them president in that time period, who would pick? Who would you pick? I would pick Obama. So a president from the past 50 years, and that one person is going to be president each of those times. So basically, I'm saying which president from the last 50 years would I pick to replace George Washington? Um, this also depends on what point in the 1900s or the 1800s. I mean, in the 1800s, are we talking about like the 1820s or are we talking the Civil War? If I can pick the time and place they go, and from the last 50 years, so we're going back to 1976. So my options are Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, and Trump. Um, I don't think I'd pick Obama because he'd probably just get killed if he went back and said, "Hey, I'm a black man and I'm the president now." That probably wouldn't work out too well for him. Um, I wouldn't pick Carter because he would try to settle too many things too peacefully, where that would not work out very well. See, the problem is I would probably pick Biden from like the first year or two. That's why I wish he would have ran in 2016 because like for his vice, but I'd say probably Bush because he had so much experience in different echelons of government. Director, he was in Congress, he was a vice, he was a president, so he'd probably be a pretty good pick, and he has that right balance between diplomacy and using force when it mattered. So I think he would probably be a good pick. Clinton would be a go to George Washington. Clinton would be good. I think he would be good. And there wouldn't be a lot of media and press to report on all of his shagging of everything in sight. Yeah, Clinton or Bush, I mean, basically at that point in time in the mid 90s, uh, the Republicans and the Democrats are basically the same. So yeah, either one of those. But that's a great hypothetical question. I like that. It made me think a lot. But again, there's just so much there because depends on what period in the 1900s. Because Bush was already president in the 1900s, and obviously the 1700s we only had the one president then. So I mean, it would be replacing Washington. And in the 1800s, that was an eventful century. So there were a lot of wars there. There's a civil war. I mean, the United States becomes a manufacturing and economic powerhouse by the end of the 19th century. So there's a lot of things you could change or screw up there. We'll probably wind the stream down in the next 8 or 9 minutes. Been going for almost an hour, which is great. I said this last stream, it's been my favorite, but this one has been, we had a lot of engagement in this one. And I really appreciate everyone's thorough discussion and everyone being civil and polite. I know a lot of my takes sometimes are not, or could be considered inflammatory. I try not to make them be, but especially because I don't refrain from modern politics. So when I do a presidential ranking stream, that'll be real interesting, testing how patient you guys are with me. And we'll probably set that one up for next Saturday. I think a week from tonight we'll do that. We'll probably have to cut it in half, depending on how fast I can get through them. Which president would you have handled the current Venezuela situation? Again, I would probably have said Biden if he would have been a little bit younger because he had so much experience in the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate and as the vice president. He was effectively Secretary of State as vice president. But outside of him, Carter maybe. This is probably one instance where Carter would have been a good choice in terms of diplomacy. But then again, probably not because really what Venezuela needs is the people to have a regime change. And a Bush or a Clinton or a Bush Jr. would have all probably went in the same, maybe not the same way Trump did, but some kind of Persian Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan type situation. Maybe Ford. I think Ford might have actually been a good shadow pick for that. Definitely not Eisenhower because his response would have just been to kill Maduro. Kennedy actually probably could have been a good one. If Grant was with Lincoln at Ford's Theater with him instead of Henry Rathbone, do you think Lincoln would have lived? No, I don't think. The only thing that would have saved Lincoln was his bodyguard being on duty because the first time anyone's ever picked Ford. What ends up because Rathbone gets into a squabble with Booth, but he gets into the squabble after he's already shot Lincoln. Rathbone didn't even know he was there until that happened because obviously if the squabble happens first, Lincoln would have heard it and just gotten out of the way or probably just kicked Booth's ass. But Grant being there would have only probably just resulted in Grant potentially getting killed too. So Lincoln's mistake was dismissing his normal bodyguard and having some local dumbass police guarding him. But it's amazing that I guess because we had never had a presidential assassination, but especially at that point, you need to have a company of Union soldiers following Lincoln around everywhere he goes. And one thing you have to keep in mind, Grant was a small man. I don't know his record about fighting hand to hand. He definitely was willing to fight, but he was a pretty small guy. Booth wasn't a huge man, but Grant was not an impressive physical specimen. If any Union general I was going to pick to be there, with Lincoln, it would probably be like Sherman. Yeah, major error of judgment. Yeah. Now, ironically, though, it probably worked out in Lincoln's favor because he would not be remembered nearly as fondly if he lives through that second term. He just wouldn't. We would not regard him as the greatest president of all time. He'd probably still be up there, but we would think of him much less fondly. Ah, oh, damn it. Now I want to go watch Lincoln again. That is my favorite movie. That I think I've decided that is my favorite movie of all time. Daniel Day-Lewis is just the GOAT. Greatest actor of all time, bar none. You win that Oscar in 3 different decades, you're the man. I wonder how Lincoln would have handled the Venezuela situation. Maybe he would have deported Maduro to Canada. Thoughts on the Trump Venezuela situation from anyone in the chat? And honestly, and anyone who doesn't know, Henry Rathbone actually ends up, his wife was with him at the theater when Lincoln dies. He ends up killing her like 20 years later. He kind of, after that event happens, he goes into just a manic state. He ends up, I think, in a mental asylum, but he ends up killing his wife that was with him that night. Grant is the only president to get pulled over by the police for speeding. That is true. That man liked to go fast, and Grant was one of the greatest horsemen we've ever had as president. Trump's got to pick a successor immediately, or this thing is going to decline into chaos. I think you're right. I just don't think he's going to. I don't think he can be bothered. Well, now what's going to be curious is what's going to happen to Maduro. You know, is he going to get a legitimate trial here? How's that going to work out? And then what's going to happen if we? I mean, are we going to execute? You know, a head of state here? You know, we've never done that. Or are we just going to send him back to Brazil to be Saddam'd? You know. And I actually made a prediction that we're going to get a bunch of Trump statues popping up in Venezuela or in South America because of this. You know, the lost cause of the Confederacy is already very popular down there. They'll just throw one up next to every statue of Lee. We tried Noriega. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Now, that's probably one thing Trump wants to happen is to have a very public TV aired trial that can go on for, you know, just weeks on end to be a, you know, a distraction from any other issues he's got going on. All right, guys. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up tonight's stream. Thank you, every single person who stopped by to have a discussion. This has been fantastic. And for next Saturday, we're probably going to try to get through probably at least half of the presidents in terms of ranking them. So stay tuned for that. We'll probably do a stream or two in between then, depending if any major updates happen here or some big anniversary of something like the Emancipation Proclamation happens. But thank you all for showing up tonight, guys. I appreciate it. And until next time, never stop learning.